thank you all for coming, first off, and to welcome you and to welcome our special guest today. This is a rare, kind of interesting opportunity for the WKU Glasgow community, and I know you will give Dr. Hutchins of Bellarmine University, a professor of anthropology, your full attention. Phones off, away, under the bus, outside, you know me. If you don't, you will. I will call you out for texting. It's incredibly rude when somebody has made a special trip here to give information and knowledge and expertise. He deserves your respect, and that makes us all look bad. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hutchins and let him give you a bit about what he's talking about and some of his expertise. So,
thanks for showing up. I appreciate it on an afternoon when you've probably got other things going on. What I want to do is tell a story that has a lot of stories embedded within it. And it is the story of my relationship with a particular place, the country of Ecuador. I grew up in a small town in Kentucky, and the idea of going somewhere that far away was pretty intimidating when I first went. But I'm here 30 plus years later, and I'm still going to Ecuador. And so when Western decided to have this year where they highlighted one particular country and they chose Ecuador to start off with, that started the wheels rolling, and people that I know on the Western campus called and asked if I would come down and talk about some of the experiences I've had there. So that's what I'm going to do, is to talk for a while about various moments during those 30 years, from the beginning when I went down with the Peace Corps to this last summer. And I've got some slides that got to go along with it. The first one I wanted to get you oriented. Hopefully you can see enough on the screen here. The map on the left here is the map of the country which straddles the equator. You probably can't see where it says Quito there, the capital. Quito is right on the equator. And then you've got part of the country north, and then part of the country in the southern hemisphere. Where a lot of the stories that I'm going to tell you are just north of Quito, about an hour and a half on the Pan American Highway going up to Colombia. There's the very top spot that's marked there. It says Otavalo Market. Otavalo is the town where I go every summer now. I take students there. I take students from the University of Wisconsin. I teach at Bellarmine, but I do the summer program for Wisconsin. That's where I graduated. And so the stories I'm going to tell you are around that community. It's a native community, an indigenous community. Some of the other places I'll mention, without maybe context, are Cotocachi, which is another primarily indigenous town that's about a 20-25 minute ride from Otavalo. It's on the other side of the Pan American. I'm going to mention probably the community of Zuleta, which is a small indigenous village, and it's on the eastern side of this volcano here, Mount Imbabura. That's another place I'm going to mention. It's a volcano that stands to the western or the eastern side of Otavalo. There are one or two more spots that I'm going to mention, but when I mention these names, most of them are just small indigenous villages. When I take people down, students or even family or friends that come to visit, we go to a lot of these small places. We don't spend a lot of time in the larger cities. So these are the stories that I'm about to tell you some of them involve my professional life in Ecuador, some of them involve personal experiences that I've had there. Before leaving Quito at the end of June, this past June, I jotted down some memories of what I felt was a particularly emotional trip. I'd been traveling 2 months in Peru and Ecuador with students, and I was ready to go home to see my family. But if home is where the heart is and family is a true blessing, then surely I was leaving another home as well when American Airlines lifted me over the Andes and toward Miami. Pieces of my heart and occasionally the contents of my stomach have been scattered across the jungles, the mountains, and the coast of this beautifully diverse country for over 3 decades. My stories of Ecuador now are less about travels and more about attachments, less about visiting and more about dwelling. The memories of 2014 included horseback riding through a field of multicolored quinoa. You can see it emerging there. Quinoa is a wonderful grain from the Andes. Becoming godfather to two beautiful indigenous children, Mateo and Rochelle. You can see them with their parents there. I've known their parents for a number of years. Trading jokes and piranha fishing with Winter, this guy here, who's a guide in the Amazon forest where we go every year. Helping another godson, Diego, buy his first guitar. He's about 14 years old, loves music, no money to buy a guitar. And then hanging out with a wonderful woman, a midwife named Rosa Colta, an indigenous woman who's delivered countless children in that part of the country. My affair with Ecuador began in 1983. After my request to be sent to French-speaking West Africa, the Peace Corps logically invited me to Spanish-speaking South America. My memories of 30 years ago are both vivid and vague. I clearly remember the awe I felt as I looked out the window of my new Quito home to see the Chicha volcano. And there's a picture of the volcano that sits on the western side of the city. A green giant, for sure, and still active. The smell of diesel fumes and the honk of car horns still remind me of Quito's streets. As an agricultural volunteer in the Peace Corps, I trained in the capital, but ultimately ended up in a rural area of the coast, just a few miles from the equator. From that experience, I recall the smell of coffee and cacao beans drying on sidewalks, merengue and marimba music, and then cocado stew with coconut milk and seafood. I lived in a place called Quinindé. There's a couple of images there. A predominantly Afro-Ecuadorian town in the green province of Esmeraldas. It was hot and dusty in the summer and hot and muddy in the winter. It was where Ecuador began to leave traces on my heart and in my soul. Here are a few passages from the journal I kept during those 2 years. I didn't write every day, but periodically I would stop and write down some event that happened, something that struck me. March 16, 1983, while visiting volunteers during training in the Amazon. Got back from the Amazon yesterday. On Saturday, we walked for 2.5 hours into the jungle to visit a small village. Very rough walk, but beautiful scenery. Storm with high winds and hail in the jungle. Bathed in the river Archidona that night. October 26, 1983. Got back last night from a trip to the village of Puerto Rico to take blood samples for Don Mendoza. Beautiful 2-hour ride by horseback. Went to church with them at night in the middle of the forest near the school. Amid rain and black flies, I got the samples the next morning. Saw several toucans on the ride out. Rode all the way to La Union on sacks of dried coffee. And then March 17, 1984. The riot truck that came into town last night did its damage today. It went through Quinindé shooting tear gas bombs and water. Much of it took place right outside my window. People hid in the church and priest house and threw rocks. I stuck a couple of beers in the freezer and listened to Kaywood Ledford call a Kentucky Brigham Young basketball game on Armed Forces Radio. And the rioting had to do with, I can't remember, I think it had to do with schools. A lot of times protests would break out. People don't have access to the ballot box the way we do here, so these things would break out periodically. Yeah?
I'll let you answer my question, Doc.
About the protest?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you never knew when some of these things were going to happen, but this one happened to be unfolding right outside my window, which is a little bit concerning.
Always pleasant.
Yeah. Other entries recount all-night dancing during festivals, smashing bugs, eating soup with cilantro, and sharing my shaving water with a monkey in my host family's bamboo hut, and running into the street with the rest of Quinindé as the earthquake that devastated Popayan, Colombia, rattled our homes far to the south. At the end of 2 years and 3 months in the jungles, mountains, and beaches, among the students, farmers, protesters, salsa dancers, and mosquitoes, enduring the burning sun and the buses from hell, I was afflicted with something best described by John Steinbeck. And I'm quoting Steinbeck here. When I was very young and the urge to be someplace else was upon me, I was assured by mature people that maturity would cure this itch. When years described me as mature, the remedy prescribed was middle age. In middle age, I was assured greater age would calm my fever, and And now that I'm 58, perhaps senility will do the job. Nothing has worked. In other words, once a bum, always a bum. I fear this disease is incurable. We find after years of struggle that we do not take a trip. A trip takes us. And that's
Amen.
from his book, Travels with Charlie. If you've ever been on a trip that really moved you, then you know what I'm talking about, or what Steinbeck was talking about. I made several other voyages to Ecuador in the decade following Peace Corps. I did some project analysis for the Kentucky-Ecuador Partners of the Americas and studied Quechua in a Fulbright program. I began annual travel there in 2003 when I became director of the University of Wisconsin Summer Field School in Ecuador. This program takes health sciences students there for 5 weeks to study Spanish and medical anthropology. We traveled to the Amazon and worked with projects on the coast, but our home base is in the Otavalo area, the area that I pointed out when I started. Over the past dozen years, I've reconnected with old friends and made many new ones. Ecuador is now part of my cycle of life, but not simply as a destination to which I arrive in May and from which I depart in June once the work of the field school is complete. There are loves and fears and adventures and disagreeable people and places that influence me throughout the year. I can use my own discipline and the wisdom of 2 anthropologists in particular to help me organize this cumulative experience into something that has form and meaning. Mary Catherine Bateson, the daughter of anthropologists Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, writes from experience about the richness of moving beyond one's familiar ground to eat, laugh, and dance with others. She writes about, quote, a strange and special freedom that goes with entering another culture and entertaining different ways of feeling, realizing that they differ not in virtue or rationality, but in cultural appropriateness. As we find our way, sometimes clumsily among another culture, we invariably learn something about ourselves. Another quote from Bateson, exposure to difference encourages breadth of attention, a way of seeing that underlies ways of continuing to learn as an adult. She writes in an essay titled Composing Our Differences. For every opening to different cultural traditions is a rehearsal for dealing constructively with inner or outer change. I especially like Bateson because, unlike some who instinctively respond to difference with a snarl, she sees opportunities for growth and maturity. She encourages readers of her book, Peripheral Visions, to get off the sidelines, get into the game, join the dance, get over ethnocentric anxiety, and experience the potential for learning from others who may not look like you, but who are not to be feared, judged, or avoided simply because they are different. Bateson, I think, would embrace the Inti Raymi or Sun Festival dancers of La Calera in all their menacing glory. La Calera is one of the places near Cotocachi that I showed you on the map. She would find a unique sense of unity in their dusty march, their piercing whistle, and their drunken bravado. I first experienced this version of Inti Raymi in 2005 after I learned that this annual celebration in the town of Cotocachi included ritualized fighting that had a pre-conquest history in the Andes. The celebration of Inti Raymi marks the end of the growing season for corn and other major crops. The rain has ended, and Mother Earth has exhausted her energy and once again providing sustenance for humans. It's time to ritually thank and revive her, while purging negative energy that's built up over the year. Native people kick off Inti Raymi at midnight of the summer solstice with a collective bath in sacred pools. Here's one of the images down near Cotocachi, where they go in, get in extremely cold water, and then beat themselves with stinging nettle. The cold water and the sweep of the body with nettle combine to cleanse a person in preparation for the new cycle of life. This is followed by many nights of sharing food, making music, and dancing. It's an incredible time to be in a native community. If you take Bateson's advice, you join in the dancing, eating, and drinking. On 4 separate days of the festival, indigenous groups leave their villages to march and dance their way into Cotocachi, the county seat. I want to show you a short video. This is part of the research that I just talked about down on the main campus. The festival itself spans several weeks, and the fighting is only part of it. But I've been looking at how the fighting has gotten more violent in the last few years, and people do die during this festival. I'll show you a little bit of it just to give you a sense of how powerful this group of people is when they come together. Let me call the video up. Yeah, there. So this is after they left their village of La Calera, and it's about a 45-minute sort of march and dance into Cotacachi, where other groups start to arrive, and that's where the fighting can break out. So this just shows them coming down the road and going into Cotacachi. But there's usually a lot of people that are walking in front of and behind the group. The dancers haven't arrived yet. This is just the group of people that's proceeding. These are all indigenous Otavalo people, Quechua. Grows in size until they finally get to the town of Cotacachi, sometimes 200 or more people. They take over the plaza there, and in the shadow of the Catholic Church, in the office of government, they put their indigenous identity on full display. The energy level rises with each day of the festival, and when enemy villages cross paths, fights break out. Historically, such battles were considered part of the process of releasing all this negative energy that builds up. Blood is spilled. Blood that is spilled is considered nourishment to the parched Mother Earth. Occasionally there are pauses when groups retreat to rest and eat. These can be especially beautiful moments when indigenous reciprocity is the most obvious. Those are the fights, and here's the meal where they stop periodically from dancing, and it's truly a communal meal. They spread, this is a it's a corn that is, I guess, the closest thing would be hominy, that they spread out, and they put potatoes, and they had bowls with roasted chicken and roasted guinea pig and avocado, lots of different things, and it's all for the group. Nobody individually fixes their own plate. You go and you eat for a couple of hours, and then they get ready, back on their feet, drink a little bit, and then they go back down to the plaza and start to dance again.
I'm about to interrupt you.
No, go ahead, anytime.
I've spent some time in Mexico, and with the vaqueros and the sombreros and everything, it seems like a lot of Mexican culture. Of course, I know it's a South American type deal, but it seems like there's some cross culture there.
What they do is they dress up in all kinds of different, they represent lots of different figures.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they'll dress up like maybe a colonial figure, and then they have borrowed, you'll see, I've got pictures of people wearing sombreros there too.
Well, that was what I picked up on, and then the chaps, the vaqueros, that type of late Mexican culture. That's what I saw there, and I mean, it sounded like maybe a Brazilian type thing also. The vaqueros, and I don't know what the word for in Brazilian is, but it's you know, the cowboys,
Yeah.
basically, and you see a lot of that. That's why I was wanting to point that out and ask that question. I mean, is there that much cross culture that we see from the border of the United States all the way down to that far?
The chaps that you see, there are quite a few people, indigenous people that worked on the haciendas, the big
Mhm.
ranches, and they would have worn something. They wouldn't have been as elaborate as that. These are a little bit more recent, the ones that you see there, and these things are expensive. They're several $100s, which is
Right,
a lot
right.
for people that only make a few $100 a month. So they're pretty standard, and I think you'd see them in a lot of places where people are working out with the animals. These black hats, they really started to appear about, from what I understand, 25 or 30 years ago. Some guy decided to make one on his own, and they were popular because they look pretty menacing. They all wear the same general style. It's black, it's pointed at the top, then they all put their own personal symbols on them. But I think people started to wear them, one, because of the look, and two, because when the rock throwing starts, these things are made out of real hard cardboard.
Touche.
Might get your head split open.
Touche, doctor, touche. Continue, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt you.
please stop anytime. We're a small group, we can just have a conversation about these things. These are the moments when I'm talking about the meal, because I've been gradually accepted into this community, so that when I show up there are multiple families bringing me food. It wasn't that way the first year or so. But also the dancing. I mean, the fighting part, it can get pretty violent, and there's a dark side of that. But just that energy of that group, I mean, you can imagine being in there, and this goes on for several days in a row sometimes. These are the moments that anthropologists refer to as communitas, when boundaries of the individual body and mind melt away, and humans are intimately connected through the pleasure of being together. Edith Turner, in a recent book titled Communitas, The Anthropology of Collective Joy, writes, quote, "Communitas is togetherness itself. It comes unexpectedly like the wind, and it warms people toward their fellow human beings. Communitas is what we feel when we're part of something larger than ourselves. You might feel it in a packed stadium as your team pulls off an upset, as I was when Kentucky played South Carolina a couple weeks ago, or when you're in the middle of a concert crowd or a political rally. I think the experience of Communitas captures for me what has become so special about Ecuador. Increasingly, I find myself lost in moments where I am less white, less male, less gringo, and simply part of humanity. This summer, one of those moments was the wedding of two friends. The previous summer, it was the funeral wake of an elderly woman in La Calera. In the summer of 1996, it was in a small church in La Rinconada, which is this beautiful village tucked back in the corner of these mountains, when the congregation sang a Quechua version of How Great Thou Art. In 2012, I joined a rowdy group that had gathered outside my hotel window. A young man was about to ask for a girl's hand in marriage. Following indigenous tradition, he brought along live chickens that you see there, and live guinea pigs tied together and dangling over wooden poles. He also had musicians, cases of beer, tubs of fruit, and a pretty Holstein cow with pink yarn tied to her ears. They danced in the street until the door of the girl's parents' house opened, and all, including the pretty cow, entered the courtyard to dance and celebrate. Such eruptions of spirit and life, often unpredictable, give one a feeling of renewed energy. When experienced in a setting that is outside the culturally familiar, they leave you with a sense that maybe we really can get along better than we do. There are too many reasons today to believe that humanity is tearing at its own flesh. And there are far too many people who believe that someone else's religion, someone else's culture or skin color are the reasons the world is askew. At a time when there's firm conviction among some that there is a singular way of knowing and being in the world, and that it exists in their homeland and nowhere else, I learned new lessons abroad. What have I learned? I've learned some Quechua and how to stomach the Amazonian delicacies of fermented yuca and palm grubs. I've learned that my church, under the pretense of bringing enlightenment, radically altered indigenous cultures in both the Andes and the Amazon. I've learned that compassion flows freely across cultural boundaries. On a day in Ecuador in 2012, when I received the cryptic message, "Alex is gone," I scrambled through emails and phone calls to learn that my 8-year-old nephew, Alex Wu, had fallen from a 6-story window and died. For the next 2 days, until I could get a flight home, Ecuadorian friends made it clear they felt my sorrow. This past summer, I visited a children's park in La Calera, one of our field sites, that was dedicated in his name. Some students collected money, donations, and we sent a couple of $1,000s down and created a children's park that's now called the Alex's Park outside of La Calera, and it was filled with children this summer when I finally got to visit. I've learned to put human faces on the immigration debate, particularly from an indigenous couple, Aida and Julio, who immigrated to the U.S. 14 years ago. During a summer, this past summer, when protesters were enraged over the large numbers of immigrant children arriving at our borders, I shared stories with Aida's parents down in Ecuador about her life in Wisconsin. I handed them a photo of their newest grandchild, Kai, and gave them all the news I had about their daughter and her family. This is her family down in Quijal, Ecuador. I now understand why Aida traveled 3,000 miles to start a new life in the U.S., and that such an immense distance represents great opportunity and profound pain. And I learned after my students and I were invited to join a family one evening in Zuleta that a dozen or so eggs, a tub of butter, some salt and sugar, fresh milled flour, and an adobe oven makes marvelous bread. But I also learned that if you increase the number of hands that mix it, knead it, and twist it into rolls, you create something truly special. The loaves may not multiply, but the conviviality does. We've been invited for a couple of years now by this family to join them in the evening. They're making bread the traditional way in this oven on the right, and then we eat a good bit of it, but the rest of it is to share for this festival. The Inti Raymi, when people come around and are dancing and singing at the house, you walk out and give them something, and they might give them some fermented drink called chicha. You might give them bread or something else. Some travelers collect countries like trinkets. It's more of a quantitative than a qualitative experience. Ecuador has allowed me the privilege of something much more profound than a stamp in my passport. I guess an Ecuador-like place was what I daydreamed about when I was supposed to be working in my dad's tobacco patch. I remember leaning on a hoe, tracing the vapor trail of a jet until I could find the silver glimmer that represented movement. To where I didn't know, it really didn't matter. It seemed more exciting than tobacco plants in July. At that point, I wanted to go to a place with a different language, food, and smell. 30 years ago, Ecuador was that kind of place. But it's now more than a geographic location on the map. It is memory layered with wisdom and emotion. Its volcanic soil channeled through foods I regularly eat there, such as potatoes and barley and wheat, is surely in my flesh. Its cultural richness has given me legitimacy as an anthropologist. But most of all, Ecuadorian friends, colleagues, and godchildren have rendered me incapable of thinking about people beyond my community as faceless others. Indeed, they have redefined community, so that when I leave home each May with a knot in my stomach, somewhere in the clouds between Miami and Quito, I know I'm headed toward a warm embrace. And there's one of them right there that's one of my godchildren.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you. Be glad to.
What is the racial composition in Ecuador? I mean, you're talking about indigenous people, then you talked about Afro-Arab, and then you talk, so what is it? Is it a tri-racial society, or?
It depends on who's doing the asking and under what circumstances, because I've seen
Okay.
anywhere
That's not bad.
from 15 to 20% indigenous to 50% indigenous.
Okay.
Afro-Ecuadorian is single percentage. I don't know exactly what, it's less than 10%. And the indigenous are pretty diverse. I mean, you've got still, at at least 2 groups out of the Amazon that haven't been contacted. Really interesting stories there. You've got several other groups in the Amazon. You've got several indigenous groups on the coast, and then you've got the Quechua, which are really diverse indigenous groups up in the mountains. The reason why it seems so fluid in terms of identity is that the relationship between the government and indigenous people, just like in this country, has been up and down. And for a long time, what the government wanted to do was just erase that identity altogether. And so if you were an indigenous person out in the countryside and someone who looked like they might be associated with the government came by with some forms and said, who are you, how do you self-identify, then you might not want to self-identify as indigenous. And people also can, when they're in their home villages and they're speaking Quechua and the men are wearing the ponchos and the women are dressed like you saw, they may consider themselves indigenous, but when they take the poncho off, and they do that a lot of times just because there's less prejudice when they go out into public space, out into a market or a larger city. When they take the poncho off and they start speaking Spanish, then a lot of them consider themselves mestizo, which is the mixture between the Spanish and the indigenous. So Afro-Ecuadorian, that identity is more stable. It's not any more elevated socially, but it's more stable. They live in a couple of pockets up in the northwest where I was, and then there's a valley that's almost all Afro-Ecuadorian up in the mountains.
Well, Doctor, it almost sounds like they're fighting the battle that has been fought for so long, and I'll use Japan, modern day Japan, or the ones in the late 1800s, modern day Japan versus samurai, or even the farmers that are here fighting the 20th century battle that, from here to Lexington. It sounds very similar, very comparable, very, the government, and even modern day times, the government is, and I'll use the Second Amendment. You use the Second Amendment out in these parts is a little bit different than if you go to Washington, D.C. You'll get different tones. So it sounds like they're fighting the same battle we all are.
Yeah, and really the power in not just Ecuador, but in a lot of Latin America, traditionally was held by just a few institutions. One would be people with land, originally.
The original aristocracy and
right.
Yeah.
And so then the military, the Catholic Church, some of that's changed. The indigenous people got together in 1999. Things have been building for a while. They got together, they left from villages all over the country, from the Amazon, from south in the Andes, from the coast, and they marched on foot all the way to Quito. And they came together outside the city. And then they came in, they were in the parks, the churches put them up, and people in Quito freaked out. Quito is predominantly non-indigenous, and they're urban, and they've historically looked down on these indigenous communities as backward and kind of an embarrassment to the rest of the country. But when they arrived in large numbers, and finally the rest of the country said, okay, they want something, we better listen to what they're saying, or things are going to get worse. And so from then on, for the next, up until now, indigenous people have gotten more and more power. Things certainly aren't the way they should be there, but you see them in pretty high levels of government. You see them in businesses that you didn't see them in before. So, unfortunately, everywhere you go, we're not going to talk about any country that really has got it right in terms of giving everybody the respect that they're due. So, historically, circumstances change. It might be one group during one period and another group during another. It might be because one group has less of political voice, or socially they're lower on the scale. So, yeah, somebody's always getting screwed, I think, is the bottom line.
Absolutely.
So is that the equivalent of our civil rights movement then, or our AIM or Red Power? Would that be the Quito March? Would that be sort of comparable?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Circumstances are different, and there's not a single voice. The Amazonian indigenous people, they're dealing with oil companies out there, which they're not dealing with in the mountains. So one of their primary gripes out in the Amazon has to do with these companies coming in and what they're doing to the environment. But the indigenous communities in the mountains, they're focused on something else. And so although we call it an indigenous movement, there definitely are some divisions within.
Well, that was typical of AIM, or typical even of the civil rights movement. There are certainly variations within these sort of, I'm a racist woman. in case you hadn't figured that. Can you talk a little bit more about Inti Raymi and your research on it? Because that is incredibly fascinating. It seems like it's one of those cultural elements that's been retained, which is somewhat difficult sometimes with colonialist powers and sort of incursions from different people. So can you just talk about kind of your research on that? Just because it's
Yeah,
really neat.
the festival itself was pre-conquest. It was going on for a long time, and it had to do with the end of the growing season, primarily corn. Corn is a big crop throughout the Andes. It was the Inca, really the Inca currency. So the growing season, the rainy season in this part of the Andes is starting to end in May. It's starting to dry out, and the corn stalks are getting dry. They're ready for harvest. So there's a celebration, but there's also this image of Mother Earth that's completely wiped out. She's barren, she's dried up, and like a lot of different groups, you've got to revive her before you plan on planting the next crop. And so the idea is you use ritual to do that. You bring her back to life. So the purpose for the Inti Raymi Festival, the Sun Festival, is to celebrate the harvest, but it's also to clear the air, to clear the individual body. That's what I meant with the bathing there, to get rid of the negative energy. We all accumulate negative energy at different times, and they have a ritualized way of clearing the air of all that negative energy within the individual and between communities, because these communities have their own battles. I mean, they fight over water, they fight over land. And so one time a year, they say, okay, let's just get it all out in the open. So this ritualized fighting has been going on for centuries. The Spaniards, when they first got there, saw some of this. But it was ritualized in the sense that there were boundaries where what you could and couldn't do and who fought. Sometimes it would be two communities. The communities in the Andes, we call it Andean dualism, they're structured in a way that's sort of like the yin and yang, where they're complementary forces, but sometimes they grind up against one another, and the outcome can be violent. So they saw these fights sometimes between communities, or sometimes individuals would go at it, but then when somebody got down on the ground, that was it. And if somebody started to bleed, then they saw that as a sacrifice of blood to Mother Earth to help her get renourished. And so the fighting was contained, not that some people didn't periodically die, but if you lived in that community, you knew what these cultural boundaries were. You got these messages about what was appropriate and not appropriate. You knew when the fight needed to stop. What's happened now, and this is what I've been looking at, is that part of Ecuador, like a lot of the rest of Ecuador, a whole lot of young people have migrated. They've had to go elsewhere to look for jobs. When they leave, they go to places like Quito or Guayaquil, the two large cities, each over 2 million people, or they go abroad. They can go somewhere in the US, a lot of them have gone to Spain. Some of them make it and are successful, like the woman that I mentioned there, Aida. Some of them end up in places where they shouldn't. They end up in the poorer neighborhoods and might get involved in criminal activity or gangs. The Latin Kings, if you've ever heard of them, the Latin Kings in Barcelona, Spain were started by Ecuadorian immigrants. So I think what's happened is the community has been stretched in ways where they're not getting those same cultural messages that they were. And the cultural definition of legitimate violence for gangs is far different than what it is in this community. So if you're talking about the vice lords in Chicago, you're talking about a cultural acceptance of a very high level of violence. So my theory is that if these young people are being introduced to very, very different ways of thinking about what violence is, plus they're being exposed to weapons that never were used in these fights before. You never would have seen guns or knives or anything like that. And now, this is the big festival, and a lot of these kids come home. That's traditionally what they do. It's a giant homecoming. But they haven't lived throughout the year with these cultural messages about how to live as an indigenous person and what the proper boundaries are for that. So, and then the last talk I gave, I put up some of the newspaper headlines. For 2012, at least 4 people were killed. I think most all by gunshots. I know one had his head split open by a rock. Some stabbings this past year. I know there were at least a couple of deaths. And you just wouldn't hear that before. And now, and then, you know, along with the violence comes the prejudice starts to come out against indigenous people that this is just another example of Indians acting like wild Indians, and that's it. And nobody thinks any more about it. But the fighting itself has a long, I mean, you know, in some ways you might think this might be a constructive way. Once a year, let's all just get out in the open, have a big party, and if we really have some stuff we need to get off our chest, just whack somebody and then go on. You know, certainly not the guns and knives, but we might get a lot of things out in the open. You know, we know that it's not good to bottle up this anger. So historically, that's what, from what I understand, what would have happened is that they were therapeutic, cathartic, that the communities would get this stuff. And then some of these people that are fighting are the same people that are working side by side the next day. When this festival ends, those animosities end. And people that have intermarried within these communities are back to the same relationships they had before. But for the days of those festivals, man, if you're an enemy group, then you better look out. It could get bad.
It's interesting because in some ways I'm reminded of the potlatch festivals of some of the northwestern Native American tribes. And there was a decided effort on the parts of Canadian, I hate to say it about my home country, but Canadian and American governments to sort of, you know, very early on, like squash these celebrations because of complete misunderstanding. And I think that's sort of the dialogue that's coming out of it now, that, you know, people are misinterpreting what this is about, what it's supposed to be. Unfortunately, it's happening internally a little bit. Was there any effort on the part of the Ecuadorian government to sort of shut these down at various points, or have they just sort of let it go because it's just sort of worked really well?
Well, and this is the only place I know of in Ecuador where this still happens.
Okay.
I mean, there's still these Tiku fights that happen in Bolivia and Peru occasionally, nothing on this level, I don't think.
Okay.
But if you saw some of the footage that I showed earlier today, you would have seen riot police in riot gear, sometimes 300, 250, 300 of them. And the municipal government has tried to work with the communities to structure it so that the enemy communities are never in the same space at the same time. They still manage to find each other and things break out, but they've regulated it a whole lot more in terms of times when they can go into the plaza to dance and when they have to leave. So they've done a whole lot of things to try and get some control over this, but it still breaks out.
And sorry, I keep asking, I'm just fascinated by that. I study cultures from historical perspectives. This is fascinating. For the dancing, is it gender neutral, like all male, or is it mixed? Is it, like, how does it structure? Is it just not?
Again, if I could show some of this footage if anybody wants to see it, but there's one about a 1.5-minute segment where it shows the fighting breaking out, and the men are just ready for blood, and they're out in the front, and then the women, the indigenous women with their long skirts and their shawls, they sweep in, and they form this barrier in front of the men. And one of my good friends there is this incredible indigenous woman who I've known for a number of years. And I asked her one day, I said, you know, what is the role of the women in all this? I mean, usually I see the men doing stuff when I'm here. And she said, we provide the positive energy to the negative energy of the men. And I've seen her do that a number of times where the group starts to form and there are several of them that have been drinking a lot. They try and get out and they want to go after the enemy group. And I've seen her physically shoving men back in and telling them, you straighten up, you know, you're out of line here. And they listen to her. This woman's pretty forceful. But they also, you know, this festival lasts about 3 weeks, but they're only in Cotacachi dancing on 4 particular days. There's a 2-day span that's right after the summer solstice, then there's a break for everybody to rest, and then there's another 2 days. At the end of it all, after all this has gone on with the men, then there's 1 day that the women dance. And everyone refers to it as a beautiful day. When the women are dressed in their best, they come out, it's peaceful, everyone's having fun. So they play a really important role. And it goes back to this Andean cosmology, this relationship between forces that are complementary but sometimes opposing. And so in the end of it, everything gets resolved. The women sort of put the final touch on this therapeutic experience that they've had, and then ideally everything gets back to normal.
So the women actually have purpose then? It's not just decorate, you know, because sometimes they end up sort of being decorative.
No,
It
they're
sounds like they're
very much
active.
Very much a part of all this. And some women are presidents of communities now, and La Calera is the one I'm most familiar with, but you know, the women will get up as president of the community and tell the men, you know, you're not going to do this. This is the way things are going to be, and they're really forceful about it.
Other questions? I keep dominating, I'm sorry.
When you're in these places, are you speaking predominantly like Spanish with these people, or are you speaking like indigenous languages?
Spanish mostly. I speak some Quechua, and I did speak it much better a number of years ago, but as you might imagine, Louisville isn't a hotbed of language, so I don't get to use it very often, but I use it occasionally when I'm down there, and people really respect that you made an effort to learn the language, but it's mostly Spanish.
So they
And there aren't
actually
too
are
many-
cool with you, like knowing Quechua and like speaking it with them and all that?
They love it, but I just, the problem is when you start out with it and you can't go much further than a few greetings, then you start digging the hole for yourself. But they usually are really respectful. Yeah.
Doctor, going back to what you were saying about the festival in May, it's been a long time since I've been in school, if you can't tell. They're part of the country south of the equator, part of it's north of the equator, right?
Mhm.
So both the country itself has an upside down season, being south of the equator has the winter when the north of the equator is the summer, is that correct?
Well, you have to go pretty far south of the equator. I mean, when you're right on the equator, you go back and forth, you're not gonna notice any difference.
Okay.
When you start getting down into Peru and Chile, really Chile is where you start seeing the reverse that much. In Ecuador, it's almost
So the same?
the same year round, except that there's more rain the rain will start coming in probably somewhere around Christmas, and then it'll stay until May,
Mhm.
and then the dry season comes along. So that's the only, in terms of temperature, it stays pretty much the same.
También.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way we've been taught, is that, when you go south of the equator, then you just reverse things.
Right.
And it does happen, but you have to go far enough south for it to
Like I said, it's been 20-something years, so.
Other questions or comments?
I had another language question. That's my thing. So is there like a lot of English speaking, or like to what extent is English taught in that country? Do you know? I mean, I'm assuming in the places you've gone, not so much.
Well, there's a lot of bad English taught. I mean, you have people teaching it that really aren't qualified to teach it. Ecuador, with the last constitution, and I think it was 2008, the last constitution, we've gone through a number of them, they took some pretty important steps. Indigenous legal systems were outlawed, indigenous justice was outlawed. In other words, there was a constitution, there was a formal legal system in Ecuador. That's the one that predominated. That was the one that everybody was supposed to abide by. The same for healthcare. Western healthcare was the model that the country wanted to arrive at. So indigenous health systems, indigenous healing, the shamans, the plant specialists, that was all illegal. Not that people didn't do it, but it was considered illegal. Well, after these marches and indigenous people got more power, then you started to see some change at that structural level, at the national level. So that with the new constitution, it's now legal to practice indigenous medicine. So you can go past the shaman's house and he or she will have the sign out saying that they're a shaman. Indigenous justice is allowed within indigenous communities. And they started to put more of an emphasis on bilingual education so that indigenous children would be taught both in their native language and in Spanish. And when they did that, I think English sort of got shoved out of the classroom a little bit. If you're in a community where there is a lot of tourism, then you're going to find people that speak some English and maybe some German or French. But it's not like if you were in Mexico, you could probably run across someone speaking English a lot more readily than you would in Ecuador. One thing about Cotacachi is that Ecuador has been discovered as the place to retire. It used to be that retirees that were living on a budget might go to Costa Rica, but now they're going to places like Ecuador that have been relatively stable, unlike Peru and Colombia. So every year I go down and the retiree community from Canada and US keeps growing.
The snowbirds.
The problem around Cotacachi is that when they get some property there, they want property that looks like it did back home, which means a fairly spacious yard, a larger house. There isn't that much flat land in the Andes, and what there is, people would use to grow things on. Well, they started buying up land and building houses, and native people can't afford to farm anymore. I saw last year a piece of property going for $20,000 an acre without anything built on it around Cotacachi, and that's an enormous amount of money. That might represent 6-7 years of work for an indigenous person, so you can't raise corn or potatoes or quinoa paying that much for land, and so there's some tension been built up because of, but there's a lot more English spoken, there's a lot more US style food places that have opened up around Cotacachi, and it's not that big of a city, maybe 12 or 13,000.
So we're Glasgow.
Yeah, it's a small place, but it's gotten gringoized in the last decade or so.
Doesn't sound like it's necessarily big.
Well, it's-
It's terrible that McMansion's all of us.
Yeah, you know, it really is variable. There are people that make an effort to kind of integrate, and you'll see them at these festivals, but there are a lot of them, they build these big walls, they're gated communities with guards, armed guards, and it's sad because there's a lot of resentment building up among indigenous people, not just indigenous people, but Ecuadorians in general, that they come all the way there and then they isolate themselves. At the same time, you know, they're spending money, they've got stable incomes, and so they're buying stuff, they're buying food, and they're hiring contractors and workers to come build these houses. So it's a double-edged sword.
So it's not quite Andrew Jackson, but it's not good either.
It's, yeah, it depends on whether you're the person selling the property and making a handy, but you know, once you sell it, then you're out of the game.
Yeah.
There's just not that much good property to be had in a place like Ecuador, so for a family that sells their property, they may, and I remember when I was in Costa Rica one summer, a family had several acres and they farmed it. They were, you know, poor, but they had a stable income. They sold it. They made some money to some, I think they were from the U.S. And this guy took his children to Florida to Disney World and came back and ended up working as a laborer on the same land that he had sold. Yeah, there's some pretty sad stories associated with that.
Is there any effort from, I guess the government's not interested in sort of stepping in and monitoring any of this, I suppose, because it's too lucrative, right?
Well,
And
there was a development that some guy, I think he was Ecuadorian, had started to, he had the land and he had started to mark it off, and he was going to go in and put water system and streets and so forth in there. And the mayor of Cotacachi vetoed it all, and he had to shut it down because water is a really big issue there in the Andes. You really have limited access to water, and people were really concerned about, well, what's going to happen when they build all these homes up there and they use all this water? What are the farmers going to do? So people had already started to protest, and he finally just came in and shut it all down. So there is some resistance. I don't know at the national level, but at the local level there is.
Well, actually, that's where we used to start sometimes.
Somebody's making money off of it, and whenever somebody's making money off of it, then they're gonna have some strong allies at the political level.
Are there any other questions?
What is it that you do with your students when you go over every summer?
They are health sciences students, they're med students, they're veterinary medicine, pharmacy, and sometimes nursing. And the idea at the University of Wisconsin was, you know, we'll teach them all the medical sciences up on campus in Madison. We want them to go learn something about culture, because as a doctor, as a nurse, as a pharmacist, veterinarian, you're working with people across different cultures. And you are a more effective caregiver, that's their argument, if you're more culturally sensitive. So we go down, they've taken intensive Spanish classes for 3.5 hours every morning for the first 2.5, 3 weeks, and they live with families. And then I teach them medical anthropology, and then we go out into some of these communities you saw. I first started to have relationships based on this program. So we go out there and we'll do, in one community, we might do an animal health project. They've got a real problem they're used to. They're getting it under control with foot and mouth, if anybody is familiar with farming. We eradicated it here, but they still deal with it down there. So they've got a vaccine, but not everybody can afford it or knows where to get it. So we go in and we'll vaccinate against that. We'll give them some anti-parasitic medicine. We'll give them some vitamins. And the whole community comes out, and you know, it's a great time to be there. So we do that. We do some human health. It's not really a clinical program. The idea is just get them in that environment, and then when they leave, some of them will go into global health. There's one that was in the program a couple of years ago, a veterinarian. She works for the Centers for Disease Control, you know, the big organization down in Atlanta that's trying to get a handle on Ebola. And as a veterinarian working for that, what she's looking at are these diseases that jump back and forth between humans and animals, and Ebola is the latest example.
Ebola's a good one.
SARS, swine flu, there are a number of these things. So it's training someone like that who thinks they want a career in global health. it's giving them a little taste of it to see whether or not indeed that's what they want to do. So we've had quite a few of them that have gone on and done that kind of work.
Sounds like a good program.
I like it because, number one, those students are good students. They wouldn't be in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin if they weren't. So I don't have to worry about going down with nothing against freshmen and sophomores, but when you do study abroad with younger students, when you do
They
study
need to party a
abroad,
little bit more, I reckon.
yeah, they want to go and explore things that sometimes they probably shouldn't, and you can get in trouble a lot more quickly. I mean, students have disappeared in Ecuador. There's a couple of cases of students, and they've been younger students that have gone out on their own and shouldn't have, and they never came back. We haven't lost a student. We haven't had a student we've ever had to send home for disciplinary reasons. So they're a really good group of students, and you can see now from what I just said that I've got really an extended family in Ecuador. So the program allows me to go down and still be a part of that, and then do some research when I don't always have extra time. But just this past year, I reconnected with the guy who was director of my Peace Corps program way back when. We had a real good relationship. He's a veterinarian, and I was in an agricultural program. And he, I knew he went on after Peace Corps, he retired, and he went on to do some pretty important things. And so I wanted to go to his home community, which is about 500,000 people. It's a large city. And he was, the new mayor came into office and asked this guy if he would clean up the slaughterhouse. Literally and figuratively, it was in a mess, it was unhealthy, and they slaughter all the animals they send meat up to the mountains all along the coast. So I wrote him and I said, hey, I've got some students, especially some vet students, that would love to see how it's done down in South America. So you would be able to get in these places. In the U.S., we're trying to get him into a slaughterhouse in the U.S. now, and you have to go through all these different people. He said, sure, come on in, bring your cameras, take pictures, stay as long as you want. And we're out in the middle of the floor, and they're killing and cutting up cows right in front of us. The pigs are about ready to come in. Workers are pushing wheelbarrows full of guts all around us, and we're right in the middle of it all. And he said, do what you want, I don't have anything to hide. So it was a real eye-opener for the students. He took us to this huge animal market that he helped organize. So, and that's been important, getting back in touch with him. We really started to develop some possibilities for down the road, doing research and some other things. So yeah, it's a place that, like I said, when I leave, it's really hard. I've got a young daughter, my wife is in Louisville. It's really hard to say goodbye in May. But at some point, as I get closer to Ecuador, it really feels like I'm going home in some ways. But I'm always ready to come back home.
Oh, yeah.
in July.
So what process do you use when you go down with these students? Because one of my personal, sometimes critiques, not always, of some study away programs is that they go down with their own cultural agenda. We're going to show them how to do X, and it becomes more of a mission trip. So how do you, because it sounds like you're working very hard to do exactly the opposite, that you guys need to go down there and learn this culture, experience this culture, take it on its own terms, accept it, we can help out, we have some skills that we're working with. So how do you work with the students to really help them get over that sort of Eurocentric, American-focused bias, I guess?
Well, I made a lot of these mistakes myself.
Yeah,
when I was
we all
there in the
do.
Peace Corps, I thought, I'm 22, 23 years old, whatever I was when I went in training. This other friend and I designed this. I grew up on a farm, so we designed this project that incorporated a pig barn with a fish pond. It was going to be wonderful, right? I was going to drag the whole country of Ecuador out of poverty with this thing. And I got humbled pretty quick. So some of it is that I just know that if you go down with those attitudes, then it's just not going to work. And unfortunately, what a lot of people do is they walk away saying, well, those idiots, we brought them all this wonderful technology and these new ideas, and they just didn't appreciate any of it. So, number one, a lot of these students are seasoned travelers. They've been places before, so they know. But we have a semester-long course. It's a one-credit course that they get in Madison. So they're introduced to a lot of this stuff about global health, some about Ecuador. We have a good team on the ground. We have a guy who is from the U.S., from Milwaukee. He's a physician, and he married an Ecuadorian. He lived and worked there for a number of years, started a foundation, and he just opened the second hospital, this incredible place. Well, he's part of the team, so he knows Ecuador, he works with the students. We go to visit the places that he's helped set up down there. So they're getting, I think in order to do something like this and do it effectively, you've got to have people that know the middle ground well enough, that know that students are coming from a certain cultural context and they know something about where they're going so that you can ease them into it. There's nothing worse than feeling this culture shock that comes with being in a place where you just get frustrated, you get overwhelmed, the food is annoying you, the language is annoying you, and everything just sort of washes over you. But if we can work them into that gradually, then they tend not to, you don't see the pushback, I think, that you would have. And, you know, a lot of study abroad programs really do travel in a bubble. You know, they get in their buses and they go somewhere and then they get back on the bus and they live in a hotel or a dorm room. We, a lot of times, the biggest part of this, we're staying with families. Yeah, that's a real growing experience. We just did this spring for Bellarmine, where I teach, a new program we developed in Peru, and so we took our first group of students in the spring. And we took them to incredible places, Picchu, Cusco, they loved it all. But the thing they got the most out of, that had the most profound impact, was a 3-day experience in a very poor native community where they slept in hard beds. There was no indoor facility. You had a little space with a hole, not even a toilet, a hole in the ground. Cows, this particular community has a compound where the house and the animals are almost living together. And so you step out the back door and if you're not careful, you're stepping in something the cow left behind overnight. Everything you would imagine could really just overwhelm them, and they wrote in their journals that was the most powerful experience of the whole trip. So letting people know other people as human beings, not as caricatures, not as through stereotypes, but letting them know that they go to bed and wake up a lot like we do, and they face a lot of the same struggles that we do. They might do it on a different level. You know, that's probably the most extreme poverty any of them have ever seen. But I guarantee you, they can't think of a Peruvian, they can't think of a Latino in the same way again after sharing a house and sharing a meal with them.
I have a quick question. This is kind of a different aspect than what you've been going. I'm an elementary education major, and I know it kind of intrigued me. You're talking about how in the Constitution they had went back and they wanted to teach these children to be bilingual. Do they place a very high importance on their education?
Yeah, they know that that's the way out. So, you know, all kids, it used to be that they would have to pull them out depending on just how poverty-stricken the family was, that they may have to pull them out at a pretty early age. But if they have the opportunity, they're going to take advantage of it. Bilingual education is interesting because I asked a guy this, and then since then I've learned that other people feel the same way. When they were starting bilingual education, I was in the back of this pickup with this indigenous guy one time. I said, it's supposed to be a great thing now. You know, your kids, it's like cultural validation. They go into school and they can speak their own language. He said, I don't like it. He said, I can talk all the Quechua I want at home. If they're going to get a job, they need to learn how to speak Spanish. And we don't speak the proper Spanish in the home. I want them to go to school and learn how to speak good Spanish so that they can get a job. And it made practical common sense.
It does.
Unfortunately, like a lot of other languages, Quechua is shrinking in some places, or even disappearing. There's one group out in the Amazon, I think there may be 2 or 3 full native speakers left, and they're old. And it's right in front of our eyes, this language, Zaparon, is dead.
Have they made any efforts anthropologically to preserve it, at least for research, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's recorded, but,
It's not the same.
you know, how could you convince a young person to learn it, even if that's their cultural heritage? They've got all these other things they need to learn. I mean, if you're coming from a poor family, then you don't have that luxury of spending the extra energy and time learning a language that 2 people on the planet speak. It just doesn't make sense, and so they're doing the more practical thing of getting their Spanish down.
No, I'm not, I totally, I mean, how many English-speaking kids know Latin, which is, I guess, the comparable. But I just think that's one of the most fascinating stories, I think, that comes out of some of these, not lost, but only recently contacted communities, is that, you know, there are these sort of dying languages, and what an important cultural sort of human element gets lost with that.
Oh, so much. If you talk about language out in the Amazon, there's so much out in the Amazon to learn. Medicinal plants, healing. When I go out, I always bring back a little vial of dragon's blood. It's the sap of a tree. It looks like blood. But this stuff is great for healing wounds quicker than anything. It sterilizes, and then there's this little film that goes over the wound when you put it on, and it's like a natural Band-Aid. It seals it so that no dirt or anything can get into it. A language contains all of that knowledge about what plants to use, what not to use, how to use them, how to mix them, the spirituality, so much of it, and it just, you can translate some stuff, but it just doesn't.
It's not the same.
There are all these nuances with language that you just don't get in translation.
That's one of the things that Indigenous people in Canada, I think, are starting to pay attention to a little bit, are some of these Native American languages that have been sort of not lost completely, but are a bit. There was a movement in my hometown to reintroduce Ojibwe, for example. They offered it at my high school, which was kind of cool, but, so I think to me, language is one of the most important cultural elements we have, because for exactly everything you said. Well, I think we've tormented poor Dr.
Thank you all. I
Hutchins.
appreciate it.
This was really
Nice
amazing.
question.
Thank you so much.